Welcome back to the second day of the Regional Scrum Conference, and welcome to one of the most interesting sessions that we have in store for you just here, right now, with Sander. Sander, welcome to our Agile stage.
Thank you.
And I understand your previous session in the main stage was a total blast, that there were lots of people watching you live, that there was a very interesting discussion, but I also understood that you may not have had a chance to share everything that you wanted, that you were sort of short of time. So could you please use the next few minutes, in a nutshell, the things that you wanted to tell us and that you didn't manage?
Yeah. Well, so the talk is basically addressing the. So it started when we started organizing the conference, and you asked me to come over, and I was like, oh yes, I had so much fun last time when I had, especially the Q&A session after my market. Oh, that was a microservices talk, and it was where the room was literally filled to the brim with people. People couldn't get in anymore, so that was like. I really enjoyed that, right? So, and then I realized that there's much more to do with the fact that I've been writing code for 40 years, and that I am basically a constant learner, meaning I'm trying to learn new things or get better at what I do or challenge myself all the time. And the same goes for how I write code. And so there's a sort of a journey that I have on the way to writing more and more beautiful code. At least, it's all in the eye of the beholder, of course. So I like it, and other people might not like it. But and so I started to, in my head, compile the material that I wanted to present and the messages that I was hoping I was able to give to people. And depending on where they are in this journey, some of these messages might appeal and some of them might not. Right. So and I had a lot more. Things. So actually, my personal journey towards writing better code, and I'm still not there, of course, is not formed by a couple of really big ideas that changed my way of looking at it, but a number of big and a much larger number of very small ideas that changed the way that I look at what I do. And so I was able to present a bunch of those, a bunch of the bigger ones, a bunch of the smaller ones, but there's actually a lot more. So I could easily fill probably a whole day of, a whole day of discussions around code, around the whole collection of what I now just gathered in material. So there's lots of stuff that I didn't go into in how you set up an architecture. What about domain-driven design? What about things like single responsibility principle and OCP, and so there's lots of stuff that I've sort of integrated in how I write my code, and that got me to where I am now with writing code that still not fit in. But there were quite a few in there that I really think are really important, like is always ask questions, work on very small items, keep stuff really simple, postpone decisions to the last responsible moment. Like investigate monads, do testing as design, and those are a number of the big ones that could help people enjoy coding even more, right? So, but there's lots more. There's lots more.
This sounds great, Sander. Thank you. Help me understand. Did you sort of imply right now that you would like to be invited to Belgrade and that you have a material for a full day session already?
Yes.
So, if it could happen tomorrow, let's do it.
Yeah. So, well, if there's people interested, I'd love to come to Belgrade, of course, and we could of course organize what you think.
Okay, I think the organizers should be hearing that. Audience, please hear that carefully. Put this in your comments on the event wall. Yes, we would absolutely, totally love this. And perhaps if this tiny little thing that's been preventing us from traveling in the past year and a half, when it blows over, and it will blow over eventually, let's do it, huh?
It's a problem with larger groups, right? But if you do like 1 day sessions, full day sessions with lots of interaction and discussion, the groups are usually smaller, right? So if you have like I'm not sure how it is in Serbia right now, but in the Netherlands, well, we sort of we are losing most of the measures right now, right? So you don't see much anymore about COVID in daily life here, but I realize that's not the same everywhere. I was in Morocco, for instance, 2 weeks ago, and there you still wear masking when you enter shops and etc. So we don't do that anymore here, but it's different per country. Right? But if you do a day, a very intense probably day on these topics, there's usually a smaller group that comes in, and I'm not sure how it is in Serbia, but that is easier to organize than a big conference, I would say.
Well, this sounds great. I would never ever pass a day with an agile superstar like yourself, even if I had to wear a mask. We are not doing really great right now. Probably we are somewhere where Morocco was when you visited. So yeah, hence the online event. But you know, one day, very soon, we'll be remembering this and we'll be throwing war stories around that and jokes.
Yeah.
So let's just wait for that moment and be patient with that. So we'll be moving into questions, Sander, or we are starting now the interrogation part of the session.
Oh, yes,
so get ready. And you know, we are from Southeast Europe, you know, not the KGB style or not Securitatea, but we can interrogate. Let's put it that way. So if you feel uncomfortable, feel free to do so. Okay, a few questions. We have a question from Jelena. And we've mentioned it perhaps in a few other sessions, so it will be interesting to hear your take on it. Some people will say that there is some kind of airiness around Agile. Do you think that this is true, that there is airiness around Agile? And if so, why is that? And then a question that is related, but I will ask it later. So, airy. Are we or are we not? Airiness or no?
Now, let me give you the longer answer then. So, I started doing Agile in probably the mid-90s. It wasn't called Agile back then, but we were looking into ways that we could do software development in much shorter cycles and deliver much faster. And so for us in software development, Agile's been there for like 25 years, right? So, and it was quite specific, not so much Scrum, because Scrum is not very, it doesn't have technical, well, let's say technical practices in it, but they mostly come from ideas like XP, extreme programming, and some of them came from Rational Unified Process, some from DSDM. So a lot of these more development-oriented challenges were put into Agile. And so, but since then, so like since 25 years ago, the world has evolved quite a bit, right? So that means that many of these practices have now become, well, sort of like common ground to people who develop software. So we're moving much faster. So most of the ceremonies that we have in approaches like Scrum, we will slowly, or we are already losing quite a bit of them. So I'm in constant discussions with people and companies about whether or not to have sprints. So sprints were good if you come from an era in time where you have much longer periods of developing stuff. But if you can, like my team does, push out new features every day, there is no need for stuff like sprints and retrospectives and story point estimation and stories, and it all becomes less ceremonial. Now, that is from the software development part, which is my world basically. Mm-hmm. So what we also saw over time is that the basic ideas about Agile, not necessarily Scrum related, but the basic idea of Agile is the premise that there is a path towards constant learning, and the world continues to change and do it in small pieces and get better all the time. Those core ideas, so let's say the Agile mindset, is actually, people found that to be applicable to a lot more than where it came from being software development. So people are using it for everything that you can think of, right? They put the word Agile in front of everything. Now that, it becomes a hollow phrase in that sense, right? So you can call everything Agile these days. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't even add value anymore. So for me, the core part about getting better every day, which is something I try to do in everything I do. That is still very valid and not very fluffy or airy, but there is a lot of air in it, a lot of certification scams and all sorts of stuff. So yeah, so I'm trying to, well, not fight it, but I'm trying to stay away from it. Let's call it that. I'm not staying away from Agile because Agile is in your veins, but trying to stay away from all the fluff that people have created around it.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing that with us. I understood that you are an avid traveler. Yeah, you mentioned Morocco a while ago. I also know that you have been to Belgrade already, and that this was actually a huge disappointment to not have had the event on offline in physical premises. And we have a question that is related to your passion. And the question goes like the top 3 things from Bojana. Top three things that are common for traveling and coding.
Oh, that is a very good one. Yes. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is, as I mentioned during my talk as well, is I try to travel light. That means that there is a learning effect in that. So when I started traveling internationally, I used to go with those suitcases that you can roll and stuff like that. I had a lot of stuff with me, right? And every time I travel, I realize that I take less and less stuff with me because I look at it when I come back. So that's sort of my retrospective on my trip. And I have a lot of these smaller trips, right? Wait, I'm going to get something. Just a second. So I have a lot of these smaller trips. The less I take, the less trouble I get. Also, these days with all the COVID restrictions, you see that airlines are actually, they have new regulations about the size of what you can take, right? So you have to travel lighter and lighter. So that means this is my, I love backpacks. I have like 15. So this is my travel backpack. Mm-hmm. It's actually, as you can see, it is actually extremely small. It's a 16-liter backpack, which allows me not to take a lot of things, right? So I have to pack
Sorry
minimal.
to interrupt. Do you have anything inside the backpack?
Not now, right? But it's usually, yes, my mouse is in there.
Okay. So I interrupted you because yesterday we had a session with Ari, your country fellowman, and we actually had an opportunity to see the insides of his bag. It was a work bag. But you know, I think we're going to introduce a rule for the people from the Netherlands. You have to show us your purses, your bags, and their contents. And you know, this is a mandatory conference participation rule.
So I learned myself to travel light, and that is exactly the same as how I do what I do with coding. I lose all the all the stuff that I don't really need, and there is very little you need. Your imagination, of course, to write elegant code. And another analogy is that everywhere you go, you have to improvise, right? Things, if you travel, never go exactly as you plan, right? Like I get to a place and it is like 10 degrees colder than I thought. Or one of my best stories is I was in Seattle in the US to visit Microsoft at one point in time. And then I got a call and they said, well, you need to come and do a customer presentation. And I said, well, I'll be back in Amsterdam next week. And they said, no, it's not in Amsterdam. It's in Sydney. So all of a sudden, I had to fly from Seattle to Sydney. And there's one way across is that you go through, you have to stop over in Hawaii, right? And all of a sudden, you're in Hawaii. I didn't even bring my swim shorts because I didn't count on it. From that point on, I learned always to bring your swim shorts wherever you go, right? So, and that's the thing. It's about improvising and experimentation, about discovering new things. And that is the analogy between coding and traveling. It's actually quite good in it because it's both the same. It's about you discover new things. And traveling takes place in your head as well, right? It's experience you gather, and that's exactly the same with coding.
Thanks for sharing this. I would like to go back to the airiness or the fluffiness, as somebody put it in the question. And since you were mentioning Seattle and Sydney, and I suppose you traveled to cities other than those starting with an S, right? But the question is, how agile, is there a difference, or did you notice the difference in how agile is perceived in Europe and in other parts of the world? And Jelena, who asked the question, perhaps she thinks that Europeans are less fluffy about agile. Could you comment on this?
Yeah, that is true. I recently contributed to a book which is called Agile Across Borders, which it's quite a thick book with all sorts of stories from people from different countries about how Agile works there, right? And in Europe, we tend to be more direct than in most parts of the world. And I would say that the Dutch actually are the most direct people I know in the world. We tend to be extremely direct, and that directness actually helps if you try to do Agile, because there is less ceremony in the communication, right? And that means it's easier to put across your ideas. In other parts of the world, especially when you go to Southeast Asia, for instance, you have to be much more careful about how you put things, and you have to be much more tactical than you can do in the Netherlands and in the rest of Europe. But also there's also a difference in the speed of adoption, right? I was asked to come and do a workshop on all sorts of topics in Belgium, and people were asking me about, yes, but what is the role of functional analyst in Agile? And I was like, well, there is no such role as a functional analyst in most Agile approaches. Doesn't really link. And they said, well, yeah, but how do you convey the things that the business wants to the developers? And I'm like, yeah, well, the developers do that, right? And the business, they sit together. And they're like, what? And they have a very different, conception of what it means to be Agile, right? And there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all Agile. It doesn't fit, because cultures are different, people are different, companies are different, countries are different, regulations are different. So it's different everywhere, and people perceive it differently. And you have to be, in general, you have to be a bit more aware of what you do when you go to countries outside of Europe.
Thanks for sharing this. Sander, while we are at countries outside Europe or countries inside Europe, whatever, unrelated question, but what is the one destination, whether you had your swimsuit or not, or hiking boots, what is the one destination that you would always want to go back to?
There's actually quite a few. So I'll tell you a story about this. So to be honest, there's quite a number of locations that I would really love to go back to. But the problem is there's so much else to see in the world, right? So every time I go back to a location, it's time that I cannot spend on something else. It's the same with coding, right? You can only spend your time once. But I'll show you something else in my room. Actually, it's a coincidence that I have it here. There's a book. This is the Dutch edition. So this is my favorite book. It's a book by The Lonely Planet. I'm not advertising, but it's a big book, and it shows the top 500 places in the world. This is just an arbitrary page. The top 500 places in the world according to Lonely Planet. Now, ever since I opened this book, I got it from my sister as a present. There's been places that I tried to visit from this book, just an arbitrary page again, right? This accidentally is Pompeii, which is the number 41 that I just visited a couple of weeks ago. And so I try to visit everywhere I go. I look into the book and to see what's there. Now, the best place that I went ever is in the new edition of this book. It's actually the number one. It's a place called Petra. Petra is an ancient city in Jordan, which you can visit. It's actually quite famous, and that is just an amazing location to go to. But I also spent time in traveling around Sri Lanka in a tuk-tuk 2 years ago, and that was just an amazing experience. And so there's so many. So for me, experiencing that kind of stuff is actually what makes my my heart tick, right? It's writing code and traveling, basically. So there's lots of places that I like to go back to, but the problem is time is limited. So if I go back to places, that is also the time I could travel to other places as well.
Indeed, indeed.
But
Thanks for sharing.
The only place that I always like to go back to is the city I live in, which is Amsterdam. There's no place like Amsterdam, basically.
I think a lot of people in the audience would absolutely agree on that. Starting with me, so yeah, happy to catch up with you also in Amsterdam. Another problem, so one problem with all the travel is like there is only this little time and there are so many locations to visit.
Yeah.
On another conference with another topic, I would ask you about your carbon footprint and how you feel about it. I will not ask you this, but yeah, let's just keep it in mind.
I have a short answer about this. So I try to fly as least as possible. Unfortunately, I always like traveling a lot. So what I do to sort of balance out a bit is that I use my car almost not. So I usually either walk or I ride my bicycle for quite long distances. Actually, I also have solar panels on my roof, and I have an electric car. So it's I do something to get it back. So I do like to contribute.
I think this is great from your side, actually. And you know, those Dutch, they bicycle everywhere, which is amazing. And for me, it's quite a shame that here in Southeast Europe, in our region, we have quite amazing climate, and we could be cycling probably 365 days a year.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, there is a bit of infrastructure missing, and probably some of infrastructure missing here. But anyways, let's move to our topics. It's been amazing here.
We are lucky, by the way, in the Netherlands because we have the best bicycle infrastructure in the world.
Yes, but you made it. It was not sort of given to you. But anyways,
true. It took time.
We are moving away from the topic. Well, let's keep it. If we ever have a meeting with our Minister of Transportation or something, I'll bring you along. So Petra and Sri Lanka. Anybody, if you didn't catch it, if you haven't been there already, so this is Sander's top places where he would go back to again, along with probably other 50 places or so. So let's keep it in mind. We have around, sorry, just to check, 20 more minutes. So I think we are good to go with a few more questions. Could you perhaps bicycle to Belgrade for this master session with you?
Sounds like a good idea, actually. So Belgrade is around, what is it, 1,300, 1,400 kilometers?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, it could take me about 2 weeks, but that sounds like an interesting idea. This summer I actually bicycled in Sweden for around almost 500 kilometers. So I'm actually looking into bicycling longer distance. And
this is great.
Yeah.
Well, let's keep it in mind. Happy to provide the logistical support, but don't expect the bike lanes that you have in the Netherlands and Benelux overall. So another question. Many people in the audience actually do have very, very full schedules. Let's not say crammed, but full and overflowing. How to boost motivation for learning when you have such a schedule?
Yeah, I know that feeling actually. My schedule is overflowing. I have a more than 40-hour per week role as the CTO of this e-commerce company where we're building a new platform for them. And beside that, I do some small coaching jobs. I'm actually hoping to get to Bucharest soon to do an assessment at a company. But and next to that, I also have 3 kids, 1.5 of which live with me because I separated from my mom. So my 25-year-old daughter lives with me full time, and my 16-year-old son lives with me half time. My middle son studies to be a drummer, so he lives elsewhere. But I also have my mother to take care of, which you saw in the deck, and I have a very good relationship with my girlfriend, who actually delivered a talk at the conference yesterday. I try to travel a bit, and I try to learn a bit, and So busy schedules is something that seems to be hard to avoid these days. The trick is basically to realize that you can only spend your time once, right? So you have to spend it on the things that you find important. That is, if you find work very important, that's fine, right? If you find doing stuff with your kids, like I travel with my kids a lot, is something you find important, do that. But spend the time on the stuff that you really, really want to spend your time on. Working 80 hours per week is not necessary. If you like it, that's okay. But if you have other stuff that you find more important, the only rule I have on that, and it actually grew on me from, I had a very serious burnout about 10 years ago. And the one thing I learned from it is that you can only spend your time once and spend it on what you feel, right? It's, what is it, left, right? What you feel here, right? If something feels uncomfortable, you know that you're on the wrong path, right? So follow that. So follow your guts and your intuition, right? That is, well, basically the topic of the talk again. So follow your intuition about what you feel is important and spend your time on that. Don't waste it on other stuff. Like when I got my current role, I said to the CEO of the company, said, well, I'd love to be the CDO here, and I really, really think there's lots of stuff we can do, but I'm not going to spend my time in meetings. So you can put me in meetings for about two times per week. That's it, right? So spend it wisely, I said. Also, I said to him, if there's stuff going on with my kids, like on Mondays and Tuesdays afternoon, my kid comes home from school. He's 16, by the way, so he can perfectly handle himself, but I am there, right? So that means even if you want me to come into the office, I'm not going to do that. And I've done that for most of my career. So it's about setting priorities. That's the only way to incorporate stuff that you want to do, which includes learning maybe, into a very full life.
Thank you for this. Actually, I think the priorities, setting priorities is the key word here, and finding what really matters to you most and what matches with your core values. So if learning, getting ahead or whatever is your core value, fine. If supporting your family is another core value, you will find a way to prioritize them both and work on that. And funnily, interestingly, your session on the main stage, if I'm not wrong, was titled The Zen of Programming, right? And I think this was also almost sort of like the Zen of living, the thing you just shared with us.
Yes, that is very correct, actually.
Thank you for that. And then you also shared with us the size of your travel bag or of the travel rucksack, which is also good to know. Less is more, right? We have a few more questions. When could you apply lightweight and middleweight agile approaches?
A good question. I would. So here's my thought on this. I always travel as light as possible, right? So all the fluff that I can get rid of, I get rid of. Literally, right? So that means the agile approach I'm following now is there's work coming in, we do the work, done. That's the whole approach. We don't estimate, we don't have sprints, we don't have sprint plannings, we don't have plannings, we have a roadmap that we have, right? There's work coming in, there's 12 people to do the work. Every item that comes in, we check and we see who's going to do it. People get together, they do the work, they deliver it into production, done. Of course, this is the easy thing. There's lots of groundwork that we need to do to get there, right? It's basically changing culture. So I always travel as light as possible on any given assignment or gig. I always check out what is the least amount of ceremony that I have to drag along to make people do the work. Or that sounds a bit harsh, but to get the team to work best. Now that is different for every team. I worked in a company where there were 6 big teams and they were doing very different things. And some of these teams were really happy with how Scrum worked. Right? They were happy with having sprints and a product owner and a Scrum master. And there were other teams that really didn't like Scrum for 2 different reasons. One of them was that they were delivering slower. So these were teams that actually were building software in COBOL. Actually, there were slightly middle-aged and older people, and they didn't really appreciate the speed of Scrum, right? So they went on a slightly slower scale and then delivered every month, but did not have sprints and iterations and Scrum Masters and stuff. They had a very different way of working. And then there were teams that were way beyond where Scrum is, which is the teams I usually work with, that go on much shorter cycles or even don't even have cycles, but just, just as I just explained, just do the work. And work comes out of the board, and the board follows the roadmap, and that's basically it. We don't estimate, we just deliver as fast as possible and as good as possible. So my current team works like that, actually. So depending on where you are, different approaches work. So it's not like, so the previous manager of the company that I just described, he was like, they all need to do Scrum because we all need to work in the same way. The world isn't like that. People aren't like that. People are different, right? So if people don't want to do Scrum, that's fine. If people want to go slower than Scrum, that's fine. If people want to go faster than Scrum, that's also fine. Well, that's better, of course, but so it depends on where you are and with whom you are, which works best. So there is no one size fits all. And certainly it's not Scrum, because Scrum is just it doesn't do much actually. But anyway, enough about Scrum.
Oh, I thought you were going to grab some coffee. I sort of connected the Netherlands with exceptional. There it
I had it already. And this was my sixth cup, so.
Okay, so really you're a true Dutch then. Oh, yeah. No doubt about it. Great. We have a question about balance. Now it's fairly specific, but as most of the topics that we discussed, we can look at it from a wider perspective. So Alexandra is asking, balancing the work that can be done in an iteration can be hard. What teams should do to find good balance?
Yeah. So if I understand it correctly, you're suggesting that putting the right amount of work into an iteration or a sprint is hard. The easy way out is don't do it. So the problem I have with the whole idea of sprints is that, so we started opposing the idea of working in projects a long time ago, right? So we said, well, you have to build products and don't do projects. The problem with projects is that they have a start and an end date and an amount of work to deliver within that date, and nobody knows how to estimate it. As a result, most of the projects that we have in IT industry and in lots of other industries as well, they actually fail because we don't know how to estimate. And the whole thing is we have to realize being in a complex and chaotic context, as the Kneffer framework says, means that we will never be able to estimate because it changes all the time and we're always doing something new. If we would do repetitive, easy work, we would go into what are the complicated and the obvious zones of the Kneffer framework, which means it is predictable, it's repeatable, and it's at most complicated but not complex, which is very different. So that becomes estimatable. But in a lot of industries, including software, we are in a complex and chaotic environments, meaning it's impossible to give proper estimations. We can only experiment. Now, experimentation means if you don't have if you cannot do proper estimation, which is true in software development, you can never be precise on how much work you can put inside of a project, right? That goes for long projects. That also goes for 2-week projects that we tend to call sprints or iterations. Because if you set out to deliver an amount of work in a certain period, it's called a project. And projects don't work in this industry, whether they're long or short. So the way around this is don't do it. It's just do the work, prioritize, but then just pick item for item by item by item. Is that and loosen the idea of having to have sprints, because the faster you go, so the lead time is more important, right? The time that it takes from an individual item to be imagined, to be conceived, until when it's in production. So that time, which is called the lead time, is actually the metric that you're looking for. That decides on how fast you're going. I promised to the CEO of the company I work for, I had a long discussion with him yesterday and with the CEO about, so yeah, but what are your KPIs? how do we know when you're delivering? I said, well, the KPI that I want you to hold me responsible for is shortening the lead time, right? Once we get better at what we do, we can shorten the lead time because we have taken care of much more, well, let's say the groundwork of stuff. And then it will slowly become, you can slowly move from the complex to the complicated zoning connection, meaning it becomes slightly more predictable. But as long as it's unpredictable, putting stuff in sprints or iteration doesn't work. Even worse, it frustrates people because they estimate something that they believe they can deliver in a certain period. If they cannot, that is frustrating, right? I had a client who called that red sprints. I said, what can I do about the red sprints? And I said, well, remove that idea of having sprints, because then they're never red. And your KPI becomes shortening the lead time instead of delivering a small project.
Thank you for this insight. So shortening the lead time, and it's been working, and then you move on, next level of complexity and complicated. Okay, sure. I hope that was a good learning for our audience as well, as it was for me. I will ask you one more question, and then I think we will need to be wrapping up, just to check. So you've been a prolific author, and you've worked with many companies around the world, delivered presentations, trainings, projects. Could you please name one or two companies that you have witnessed or that you know from your work who have actually been a good example of a successful agile transformation? So it can be companies we know about or companies we do not know about, but that you witnessed, going from a old traditional large corporate to a agile organism.
There are lots of companies underway there. Of course, I cannot name individual companies, so there are lots of companies underway there. The main thing about this, what I think, is that too many companies see the agile transition as a goal, right? Management says, "Oh, we need to become agile." Often they quite even have no idea why that is. But so the first question I always ask companies is, "Okay, why are you doing this? What is your goal? Where do you want to go to? What do you want to be in 5 years' time?" Right? And from that, figure out what to do. And quite often, actually, the problems that the companies have nothing to do with agile at all. So agile is just, it's become sort of like a magic potion to solve your problems. It is not, actually. So to give you one example, is one of the companies I worked for in the last couple of years, they had a very siloed organization. So it's not a really big organization, but they really had silos. So each department was optimizing on its own behalf, right? So the management team set KPIs for each of these departments, and the departments all had different KPIs. They had their own KPIs, which meant that they started optimizing for their own work. And as we know, that is not quite optimal for the whole company, because you have to look at the whole thing as a whole, not as different departments, because you're sub-optimizing what happened. Now, those are interesting companies, because as soon as the problems get too big, and they will, in this case, their IT landscape starts falling apart, and then they realize that they get in problems. And if you can go in such a company and you can understand where the problems come from, and it's usually the culture, it's usually the structure of your organization, it's usually managing stuff top down, where we know that in most occasions more autonomous teams could do much better work. You can actually help them get there, right? But the problem is not we're doing okay, let's do an agile transformation so we can get better, right? You have to have a very particular goal and very particular problems that you want to solve, and then becoming more agile needs to be the solution to that problem too, because there's lots of problems where an agile transformation is not a solution for. In this particular case, by the way, what we did is we on the long term applied, and it takes a lot of patience, something called the inverse Conway maneuver. I hope I can explain that in like 2 minutes.
Please do.
So there's a thing called Conway's Law. Conway's Law says that the structure of your IT landscape is a reflection of the communication structure in a company or in an organization. So in this particular case, whether the organization was totally siloed and everybody was working within their own department, and there was very little communication over, you saw that reflected in the IT system. So each department had their own systems, and the poor tech people, they had to sort of make sure that the data and the behavior was in sync between all these systems that were written in different languages on different platforms and on different infrastructure. And it broke down continuously, and the degree at which it broke down grew with the size of the company. So the bigger the company got, the more revenue they got, the bigger the problems got. Now, so as soon as you realize that, you have something to talk about, because the company couldn't grow much faster than it was doing because of the fact that they were held back by the whole infrastructure that was based on the structure of the company. So what you can do is if you can start migrating away from the infrastructure and migrating away from the siloed applications into, well, let's say build a landscape of implementing business process throughout the different departments, you get them to talk to each other and you pull them out of those silos. And it's a very long, a very long journey basically to get there. It takes years basically. So agile transformations are usually sold as, yeah, we can change your company, you get better. Well, the first question is, what is the actual problem that you're solving? And the second thing is to realize that it takes a lot more effort than just saying, well, let's go agile and then we'll solve your problem, because it doesn't. Agile doesn't solve much of those problems. There's lots more that you need to take into account. In this particular example, we needed to change, so we took it from the bottom. That means that we try to inverse the Conway law to, well, not inverse the law, but inverse the structure so that given Conway's law, the whole organization would change. And it takes people to battle things like top-down management, micromanagement. It's not something you can solve by saying, oh, let's just adopt SAFe or Scrum or whatever you adopt, right? It doesn't help. You need to identify the real problems.
Great, thank you. Thank you for this. So Sander, I think we have just used our time that we had allocated for this session. I think we used it wisely, which makes me exceptionally happy. Very happy to have heard about the different perspectives you shared with us. So thank you very much for that. And we'll take you on the, let's put it an offer to come to Belgrade and give a full day, full-blown session.
Good idea.
On Agile. That indeed sounds very awesome. So Sander, thank you very much for that.